Good morning, everyone. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. Thank you so much for joining. If one of you has a chance, just type in the chat or in the Q&A box to confirm that you can hear me. Thank you so much. All right, great to see you all this morning. We are excited to be talking today about 100% renewable electricity by 2030, which is green energy consumers' top priority this legislative session. My name is Kai Salem. I'm the policy coordinator at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. I work on both Massachusetts and Rhode Island policy, but my focus is on all things electricity and buildings. And we will get started today. Today we're talking all about the legislation to get Rhode Island to 100% renewable by 2030. A few notes on logistics. First off, we will have time for Q&A at the end, but please feel free to put any questions you have as we go along into the Q&A box. I'll try to get to them at the end. It's just me on the webinar today, but we're a pretty small group, so we should be able to handle it. Please feel free to let me know if you have any technical difficulties or logistical challenges, again, by typing right into the chat or into the Q&A box. You are all muted, but again, those are there. We have opportunities for you to communicate with me. My contact information and a recording of this webinar will be available after the fact. We'll follow up with you with a link to our webinar. All of our webinars are available on our YouTube channel. It's a great resource. I recommend that you check it out because we have lots of information about electric vehicles, policy in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We just did a building performance standards policy webinar that I recommend, and there's so much more. I'll get to a few other notes and plugs at the end of the webinar, but before we go any further, I want to make sure you all know about our 40th anniversary celebration, which is happening this Wednesday at 5 p.m. at the Roger Williams Botanical Center. Green Energy Consumers has been around for 40 years. We are a nonprofit dedicated to harnessing our power as energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We started 40 years ago in Massachusetts, 20 years ago in Rhode Island. About 4 years ago, we merged the Rhode Island name, which was People's Power and Light, with what was then known as Mass Energy in Massachusetts, so we could combine our efforts fully and double down on our work in heating oil discount program, renewable electricity advocacy, electric vehicles, solar, and more. Today we're talking all about policy and what we view as the most necessary policy in Rhode Island to move the needle on Act on Climate. And with that, we will launch into things. So we passed the Act on Climate in Rhode Island, as many of you will know, last year. The Act on Climate is Rhode Island's first mandatory carbon emissions reductions goal, and it has already accelerated our climate policy work really immeasurably. There's a new sense of urgency around reducing emissions in Rhode Island from state agency administration and legislators, and we are now on a race to get to our first goal, which is reducing emissions by 45% at 2030. We also have to meet a goal of 80% emissions reductions by 2040 and net zero by 2050. This is really the bare minimum that is required by science to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. We have to be reducing emissions on this timeline. In fact, we have to be doing even better. So as we think about planning to get to these goals and ratcheting up the goals over time, Right now, we're really focused on meeting that first goal of 45% emissions reductions by 2030. This is no easy feat because the most recent greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which tabulated emissions for 2018, showed that our emissions were up significantly from the prior inventory, which is from 2016, and we are not on track to meeting our 2020 emissions goal. And we haven't really done any major policy since then that would change that picture for 2030. Yes, we have the Act on Climate, which gives us a framework for reducing emissions and created a new sense of urgency and political expediency for setting policy to meet these goals. But we don't have a lot of actual emissions reductions policy on the books. That is what the 100% Renewable Energy Standard will do. It will give us a tangible path forward to starting to reduce emissions in line with our Act on Climate goals. So one thing I'd like to point out on this slide is along the bottom here, we have a graphic from the 2016 greenhouse gas emissions inventory. It hasn't yet been updated for the 2018 inventory, but it hasn't changed that much. The biggest driver of emissions in Rhode Island is transportation. That's the gasoline trucks, light duty vehicles, and more that we use to get around the state and to get goods and products around the state. The second biggest category is all of heating and all of the building emissions. So if you put together residential heating, industrial heating, commercial heating, and leakage from the natural gas distribution center, natural gas distribution system, that is our second biggest source of emissions. Electricity is around 25%, which is our third biggest source of emissions, but it is absolutely crucial to the larger picture of emissions reductions because we need a renewable electric grid if we are to reduce emissions from transportation and heating. The main path forward towards reducing emissions from transportation and heating is by electrification. There's really no way, despite some claims by gas utility companies, to have renewable distributed fossil fuel heating in homes. To have renewable natural gas, there's no way to have renewable gasoline. We need to power our transportation and our buildings on high efficiency renewable electricity. And so getting that electric sector down to zero as soon as possible helps us across the board when it comes to reducing emissions. And that is where the 100% by 2030 Renewable Energy Standard comes in. This bill is, the numbers are S2274 in the Senate, H7277 in the House. It is sponsored by Senate President Dominic Ruggiero and House Utilities Finance Subcommittee Chair Deborah Giro. And thank you so much to our sponsors. They've done a great job elevating this bill and making it something that we feel like we actually have a chance of passage. Really exciting. Thank you to those champions, as well as many other legislators who have supported it. The bill would implement Governor Raimondo's 2020 executive order, which set a goal of reducing emissions from electricity, so getting to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. We've had a renewable energy standard since 2004. We were actually one of the first states to have this policy. And since 2004, it has done a great job reducing the fossil fuels in our electric mix. This piece of policy requires electric suppliers to buy an increasing percentage of electricity from renewable sources, which should reach 100% in 2030. That's what the new bill does. The current bill has us reaching about 30% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. That is not even close to enough to meet our Act on Climate goals. And as we will see later in the presentation, there are a lot of other good economic reasons why it makes sense to update the Renewable Energy Standard to reach 100%, not just because of the climate importance. Since Rhode Island passed the Renewable Energy Standard in 2004, more than half of all other states have passed a Renewable Energy Standard because it's such good policy. It delivers renewable electricity reliably to customers throughout the state at a very low cost to customers, and it stimulates the renewable energy market to help us develop a strong renewable energy industry in the state. Later on in our conversation today, I'll also be talking about where this bill is at in the legislative session and how you can help get it over the finish line. So if it's not already clear, getting to 100% renewable electricity by 2030 is the #1 best, most cost-effective, simplest thing we can do to get us back on track to meeting that 2030 climate goal. And it's doable. We'll dig more into this slide in future going forward in the presentation, but this slide shows just exactly how Rhode Island can meet this ambitious goal. So you can see along the bottom here, that dotted line is where the current renewable energy standard is. The black line on the top is a numeric demonstration of just how much electricity we use in the state throughout a year. So we're at about 7,500 gigawatt hours. That fluctuates or is predicted to fluctuate between now and 2030 due to investment in electricity and efficiency, as well as increased electrification. But we're about 7,500. Our current renewable energy standard has us meeting about 20% of that total with renewable electricity. To get to 100%, we need to up that quite a bit. The key to meeting this goal is going to be offshore wind. We are very lucky to have incredible offshore wind resources in Rhode Island, and upcoming offshore wind contracts will give us these big chunks of reliable, affordable, clean electricity that we can rely on to make sure we reach this goal. If Rhode Island adopts this, this legislation, we would become the first state to 100% renewable electricity. That is really exciting. A lot of other states have goals, statutory goals, that will get us to that goal. In fact, Connecticut, I believe, just passed a law to get to 100% by 2040, maybe. I'm not sure exactly. That just passed, I think, last week. And we, of course, have the federal goal from President Biden to get to 100% by 2035. Rhode Island does not often have the chance to be the first and the best at something. This is it. Because of our copious offshore wind resources, our strong history in energy efficiency and renewable energy standards, our small size, Rhode Island can meet the 100% by 2030 goal, and it will help us meet our climate goals overall. To explain just how the Renewable Energy Standard works, I'm going to talk a little bit about our electric grid and how our electric grid works. So here in Rhode Island, we share an electric grid with the rest of New England. The country as a whole is broken up into these regions. Electric grid regulation works very differently depending on where in the country you are. But for the most part, we share an electric grid with our neighboring states here in New England, and that's in the top right corner. Because we share this electric grid and because the way electricity works, I am not an engineer, I'm not a physicist. I'm just going to describe it how it makes sense to me. But it's really hard to track electrons when they're in the grid. So if we in Rhode Island said that we wanted to be 100% renewable electricity, but we share this electric grid with all of these other states, how do we know that the electrons that are coming through our light switches, into our light bulbs here in Rhode Island, how do we know that those electrons are renewable when we share an electric grid with all these other states? That is why the Renewable Energy Certificate system was developed. This is a way to track and also create a market for renewable energy in New England. So when a renewable energy generating unit produces a megawatt hour of electricity, that electron flows onto the grid just as any other source of energy, just as a natural gas power plant would produce electrons and put that onto the grid. But renewable energy generators also, whenever they produce 1 megawatt hour of electricity and put that into the grid, they produce 1 renewable energy certificate. This is a virtual signifier of 1 megawatt hours worth of renewable energy. It refers to the renewable energy content, the renewable energy component of that electron. When someone who wants to have renewable energy uses 1 megawatt hour of electricity, here you can see that in this diagram, there's the electrons are flowing off the grid into someone's house. They use 1 megawatt-hour of electricity. Their house lights up. If they want to get credit for purchasing renewable energy, then they have to buy a renewable energy certificate and retire it, which means that the renewable energy certificate gets taken out of that central database that tracks renewable energy certificates. No one else can use it, and the person who bought and retired the renewable energy, that entity gets credit for using renewable energy. This is also how the Renewable Energy Standard works, which I'll get to in a minute. This system is really important because it stops double counting. It means that you can't just happen to live next to a wind turbine and turn on your light and say, oh, I'm using renewable energy. You have to be buying it. You have to get credit for it. You have to make sure that no one else is getting credit for using that renewable energy. It also is helpful because it creates a numerical value, a quantitative value for renewable energy, which again supports renewable energy developers and makes renewable energy more valuable than fossil fuel energy. In the Renewable Energy Standard, the utility company acts as that house. The utility company is required to buy renewable energy certificates and retire them so that no one else can get credit for buying and using that renewable energy. I also want to spend a moment mentioning where our electricity comes from currently. This is the fuel mix that is on the New England grid at any one time. So this is different from the Renewable Energy Standard because this is just the average when you take all of the electrons that are on the grid at any one time in New England, regardless of different utility companies that are buying renewable energy certificates, regardless of the different state requirements. This is just what is powering the grid at any one time. You can find this out in real time on the ISO2Go app or on the ISO website. And it's kind of fun to just know what's going on the grid at any one time. I took this screenshot from last year. I'm not sure exactly where we're at right now, but I will look it up as we're talking, just to share. Okay, so right now, let's see, today is May 16th, 2022. The pie chart actually looks really similar to this. We're at 66% natural gas, 18% nuclear, 8% renewables, 7% hydro. We're probably using a little bit more electricity than we were last year because it's a warm day. And we're also using less nuclear than we were last year because some of the nuclear power plants in New England have retired since last year. Natural gas is a really big part of our fuel mix. Our goal for really the next decade is going to be figuring out how to build lots of new renewable energy so that we can start to phase natural gas out of our fuel mix. This is a quick graph of where our current renewable energy standard is at. The renewable energy standard works such that the utility company, as well as all other electric suppliers, including third-party competitive suppliers, is required to buy an amount of RECs that is equivalent to a certain percentage of the electricity that it supplies to its customers. So we'll say National Grid is the biggest electric supplier in Rhode Island because most people are on basic service. National Grid has to buy currently in 2022 about 20%, an amount of renewable energy certificates that is equivalent to 20% of the amount of electricity that they deliver to customers in Rhode Island. And on behalf of those customers, it has to retire those renewable energy certificates, taking them off of that database, making them disappear to indicate that Rhode Island customers get credit for using that renewable energy. The blue line on this graph shows where we're going to be headed through 2035 with our existing renewable energy standard. We know we can do a lot better than this, and that's where the new bill comes in. Also, for those who are interested, this is the RECs can get traced back to the original generator that produced that renewable energy. In Rhode Island, most of our renewable energy certificates are coming from wind and solar, which is the highest quality renewable energy. We also have landfill gas and biomass. We don't think of those as high quality, so we would prefer that Rhode Island move towards more wind and solar, which will hopefully happen as we develop offshore wind. I mentioned that RECs can be high quality or not. That's because in Rhode Island, we would consider a REC that values and leads to the creation of new solar and wind, new very sustainable solar and wind, as better than a REC that supports a biomass project, which does still emit few toxins into the air, even if it is more renewable than fossil fuels. We want RECs to be new. That is that they're going to support new projects, not just funding old projects that would continue to be operational, even without the additional financial support that RECs provide. This is just to say that it's really important when the Renewable Energy Standard is updated, we've especially seen this in Massachusetts, that we look at exactly what counts as renewable energy, because we don't want anyone to slip language into our existing laws that allows a non-environmentally friendly generation source to be counted as renewable energy. In Massachusetts, where we're working on similar legislation and similar policy, there's been a big debate over whether biomass can be counted as renewable energy. The Massachusetts administration wants it to be allowed to be counted as renewable energy. Advocates have done a great job making the case for why it should not be counted. As I mentioned, offshore wind is crucial to meeting this 100% goal. I'm going back to that slide from the very beginning. Now that we understand what our current renewable energy standard is and how it works, as well as this orange bar that represents something closer to what a new renewable energy standard would look like that gets us to 100% by 2030, we can see that our expected offshore wind projects are going to help us get to that total 100% goal. Revolution Wind is a currently contracted for offshore wind project that will deliver 400 megawatts of electricity to Rhode Island. That gets us in gigawatt hours. So megawatts, as a reminder, is a one-time measure of electricity. It's kind of the amount of electricity that's being delivered at any one time. The gigawatt hours, which is the unit that is on this graph on the left side, is showing in hours how much electricity over the course of the year. So that's why those two units are different. We cannot get to this goal with just Revolution Wind, though. We are going to need at least one more big wind project. For example, Governor Raimondo initiated back in fall 2020 a 600 megawatt contract for wind. That was staved off, that was really kind of delayed by the proposed sale of National Grid to PPL, as well as the transition in governors. However, there is a new piece of legislation which Green Energy Consumers strongly supports that would pick that process back up and make sure that we get a 600 megawatt wind project by the end of this summer. And that is going to be really important to making sure that we can have that wind project built and delivering electricity by 2030 in order to meet this goal. So just as we need offshore wind to get us to the Renewable Energy Standard goal, we also need the Renewable Energy Standard to account for all of this offshore wind. If we build all of this offshore wind, which we want, it's great for the economy, it's going to bring lots of good local green jobs to Rhode Island, it's delivering affordable electricity to Rhode Islanders. It's actually the cheapest form of electricity on average. It tends to be cheaper than a new natural gas plant, for example. If we want to bring all those offshore wind benefits here to Rhode Island, if we do not up the Renewable Energy Standard, we are just going to be exporting those renewable energy certificates out of state. We already have more renewable energy certificates produced in the state of Rhode Island that we can use for our existing renewable energy standard. That is due to the great job that we've done. I'll actually go back to this slide. You can see on the bottom here, net metering and renewable energy growth. Those are our two main renewable energy programs that we currently have in state. They mostly produce solar, so a lot of our solar is being supported by those programs. That is enough to get us most of the way to our current renewable energy standard. And if we don't increase the renewable energy standard, we're going to have more renewable energy from those programs than we're using up on our renewable energy standard. That means that we're building all this renewable energy and we don't even get credit for using the renewable energy here in Rhode Island. If we want to take credit for that renewable energy, if we don't want to be exporting those renewable energy certificates, especially as offshore wind comes, again, we need to update the Renewable Energy Standard. Upping the Renewable Energy Standard will also really help us keep the market for renewable energy steady and strong, make sure that supply is meeting demand. So how can electric suppliers meet a higher renewable energy standard? Say we pass this law and in a couple of years, we're jumping up from 20% renewable energy requirement to 35% renewable energy requirement. Will National Grid and the other competitive suppliers be able to meet the new renewable energy standard? Yes, absolutely. Good forecasts and predictions of the renewable energy market show that we will be able to do this in an affordable way. First and foremost, we're going to use up that REC surplus. We're going to stop exporting renewable energy. Second, we'll have long-term contracts with offshore wind that is delivering low-cost RECs to Rhode Islanders. We also have other policies that can fill the gap. We can import renewable energy certificates from other states. We can revamp our solar incentive programs. Green Energy Consumers is actually supporting other policy to do just that this year in the legislative session. We can do another big offshore wind procurement. We could invest more in energy efficiency. So many different ways we can do that down the line. But after we have entered these long-term contracts with offshore wind and used up our REC surplus, we're going to be so close to our overall goal that we can easily figure out how to get the rest of the renewable energy in 2027, 2028, and so on. I also have an asterisk note here because I think a lot of people ask about the cost of all of this additional renewable energy and the cost of meeting the renewable energy standard. The most important driver in getting cheap renewable electricity to meet this goal is to make sure that the offshore wind contracts are coming in at low cost to Rhode Islanders. And we can do that by having really competitive solicitations, going out to bid for greater numbers of offshore wind. There's a few different ways that policymakers can keep offshore wind costs down. So to recap most of what I've said today, the Renewable Energy Standard is nothing new. This is a policy that the utility companies are used to dealing with. We know that it works to increase renewable energy in our state and also to create a clear, transparent tracking mechanism as well as goal setting to get to that 100% goal. Renewable electricity is clean. The prices are much less volatile than we're seeing from fossil fuels right now, and it's better for the Rhode Island economy because it creates in-state jobs. We need energy that we can rely on. This past year has shown that fossil fuels are not reliable, but renewable energy is. It strengthens the reliability of our local grid, and it also, again, creates those good jobs in-state. Climate Jobs Rhode Island, which is a partnership between climate and environmental organizations and labor groups, including the AFL-CIO, the builders, and more. They are for this piece of legislation. They support this piece of legislation, which is awesome because they see that renewable energy is the future, and getting 100% renewable electricity by 2030 is one of the best things we can do to stimulate the renewable energy industry in state. Again, offshore wind is the key to meeting this goal, and just as we need this renewable energy standard legislation, we need to pass a bill that will get us 600 megawatts of offshore wind contracted before the year is over. So I'm going to talk briefly about where we are in the legislative session. To get this amazing policy to be the first state to 100% by 2030, we need to pass S2274 and H7277. It's mid-May, which means that we're almost at the end of the legislative session. Senators and representatives, the House Speaker and the Senate President have indicated that they want to end the legislative session by mid-June at the latest, which means that we have about 1 month or even less than that to get this bill passed. It hasn't passed either the Senate or the House yet. It did pass the Senate last year, so we're optimistic that it will again. But we need to make sure that it's passed. We need as much support as we can get for this policy if it's to happen. You can contact your senator and representative by finding their contact information, call and email at the links that I have on this slide. I'll also make sure that that's included in our follow-up email. We really recommend calling. Emails, especially if they look like form emails, don't really get read for the most part. Calls are quick, they can be easy. 95% of the time you're going to be leaving a voicemail, and you can just say, hi, my name is whatever your name is. I live in your district. You can even give the address if possible to make sure your senator and representative knows that you're a constituent, and say that you support 100% renewable by 2030, why you support it, and thank your legislator if they already support it, or ask them what their current position is. You can always direct them to more resources on our website, Green Energy Consumers. You can also find more resources on the bill at greenenergyconsumers.org. Again, we recommend calling because it's more likely to make an impact, and at least for me, calling takes even less time than writing an email. I guess one other thing I wanted to mention on what you can do to help this bill get over the finish line. We are expecting some amendments to be made to the bill before it is passed. We don't yet know what these amendments will look like. One thing we're hearing is that the Speaker and the Senate President may want to push out the date to get to 100% to 2032 or 2033. We are going to fight to keep that date as early as possible. The sooner that we get to this goal, the more likely it is that we reach our Act on Climate goals by 2030. However, we'll keep you all updated on our blog as we see amendments and to see what we support and what we don't. The most important thing we see as getting to at least 80% renewable energy by 2030, because that's really the minimum that we need to get to if we are to meet our 2030 climate goals. Finally, in neighboring states, I mentioned that Connecticut just passed legislation to get to 100% by 2040. Don't quote me on that. I would need to fact check that. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, Massachusetts is looking at updating their clean energy standard to reach 60% or more by 2030. So we also saw the two front-running gubernatorial candidates in Massachusetts have both announced a commitment to get to 100% clean electricity by 2030. This is becoming the new norm in our region, and for Rhode Island to become the first, we have to pass this now. So we, again, please call your senator and representative to let them know that you support this, and let's get it over the finish line this year. I already mentioned that we're celebrating 40 years this year. You can sign up for our spring meeting that is happening this Wednesday. We're going to have lots of food and drink. For those who are concerned about COVID, as we all should be, we're going to be doing the majority of the program outside. It's supposed to be a really nice day, and we do encourage mask wearing. All of the staff will be tested for COVID in advance, and we also encourage that you get tested beforehand. I believe vaccinations are required as well. So we're going to do our best to meet in person, but do it really safely. It's been a long time since we've met in person, and we're so excited to see you all and celebrate our 40-year anniversaries. We'll have brief conversations about our policy priorities at that event as well. As always, you can learn more about our programs and policy at greenenergyconsumers.org. For more up-to-date policy information, please follow our blog, blog.greenenergyconsumers.org. We just posted a blog on all of our Rhode Island policy priorities last week, so that should be near the top of our blog, and we're going to keep posting updates as we get them. My email is on the bottom here if you want to reach out to me after this. And now I will turn to questions in the chat. So please, if you have any questions, drop them into the Q&A. All right, starting from the top here, we have a question. Kai, are you organizing any teams of volunteers who will lobby towards passage of this legislation? Thank you so much for your interest in volunteering to lobby for this legislation. We do have opportunities to volunteer. I actually recommend getting involved with Climate Action Rhode Island. Climate Action Rhode Island is Rhode Island's 350 group, and they have a policy team that I try to attend as many meetings of as I can. They meet at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays, and they've done a great job organizing a lot of the activism for this piece of legislation. As far as what we have to do now to pass the bill, getting everyone we know to call their legislators, talk to their legislators and ask them to support it is really the best thing that we can do. So even if you're not part of a team of folks who are lobbying for this bill, you can do a lot just by talking to your friends and family, using social media and encouraging folks to call their legislators. It's going to be a crucial couple of weeks to get this bill over the finish line. Now is the time to do this. So please, please talk to your legislators and post on social media, tell your friends to talk to their legislators as well. In Newport, there is some potential pushback to the wind projects, possibly due to misunderstanding of the facts. What is the most credible resource to use were I to rebut the naysayers? This is a really difficult question. So I'll just give a personal anecdote. My mom lives in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is also a coastal town, and they are doing some work to have ports for offshore wind so that some of the infrastructure for constructing and maintaining offshore wind projects can come out of Gloucester. People think that all that talk of offshore wind means that they'll be able to see offshore wind turbines from their house, but in fact, all of the offshore wind lease areas are south of Cape Cod, not near the North Shore at all. So there is just so much misinformation going around about offshore wind. It really depends on what the claim that people are making is, but I think one thing to remind people of is the offshore wind lease areas are going to be far enough away from land that people won't be able to see them. The wind turbines are 1 nautical mile apart from each other, which is plenty of room for boats and other places to go around. And finally, a lot of research has demonstrated that the offshore wind turbines actually they create new habitats for animals. There are some potential negative impacts on marine life, right whales, but the offshore wind companies have worked with environmental organizations, including National Wildlife Federation, Conservation Law Foundation, and more. Audubon Society is another one to mention, to mitigate the impact of offshore wind development on marine life. For example, I love this detail, offshore wind developers have to have at least 2, I believe, maybe 3 different ways of spotting right whales while they are installing offshore wind turbines. And if a right whale is spotted at all in the vicinity of these projects, the turbine construction ceases until the right whale leaves. This includes drones that are watching out for right whales, as well as someone in a helicopter looking out, spotting right whales. So I say this as an example of the many ways that these projects are well overseen, and environmental groups are completely supportive of these projects. We believe that they're going to be really positive for our region, and the impact on marine life is mitigated. We have a question around why is solar not more of a priority? I would say solar is a priority. We don't have a lot of space for solar in Rhode Island. We work with other organizations, conservation organizations, to minimize the impact of solar on green space and put it towards developed areas and rooftops. We just don't have as much capacity for solar as we do for offshore wind in Rhode Island. However, solar is really important. I don't want to minimize that. We want to see a lot more solar on rooftops, schools, carports, and more. And we are working on policy that would expand solar programs for developed areas. We think that that is key to getting the rest of the way to that 100% goal. However, we can't do it on just solar. We already have solar programs. What we don't yet have is enough offshore wind to meet our goal. We have a question about the heating sector. As you all will remember, electricity is important, but it's not the whole thing. The biggest source of emissions in Rhode Island is from transportation. We support legislation called the Electric Transportation Act, which will create a pathway towards phasing out new gas vehicles by 2030. On the heating sector, we support investments in energy efficiency. We support moving towards low carbon or zero carbon buildings funded from state or federal programs. We also support building energy reporting and building performance standards. So we do have a lot of different policies on all of the major sectors of emissions in Rhode Island, but we see 100% renewable electricity as kind of the #1 thing we can do to reduce emissions across the board this session. Not to say these other things aren't important, but this is the one we're really focusing on right now. I do recommend that you all check out our Rhode Island policy blog, which we posted last week, because that goes through some of those other buildings policies and why they're so important. We also just posted on our YouTube the webinar on performance standards, building performance standards, which digs into why that policy can help reduce emissions from building sector. There's also a question around, will we see an increase in the electric bill short run with all these costs in developing the wind projects? Great question. So the electric bill is, I think there is a lot of narrative around how tied the electric bill. I hear a lot that people's concern that renewable energy will drive up electric costs. However, renewable energy is not a major driver of our electric bill. Most of our electric bill goes to the utility company for keeping our distribution system up and running, maintaining the distribution system. That's the poles and wires, the substations, nothing to do with the actual generating facilities that produce electrons. Another major factor in our electric bills is fossil fuel volatility. We will see our electric bills go up big time next winter. I'm saying that now because these electric bills are set, the electric rates are set in advance, and also because we see what's happening in the market. Sometimes electric bill changes lag behind what happened in the market to drive it. So National Grid, for example, had already locked in its electric rates before the global political events that drove up the cost of fossil fuels. So we're going to see those global political events start to affect our electric rates next winter. Those things have nothing to do with renewable energy. Long-term, offshore wind is going to be keeping our electric rates steady and low. That also should be happening in the medium term as well, because the cost of offshore wind development is spread out over the entire length of the contract. So what will happen is that the utility company is going to enter a 20-year contract with the offshore wind developer, and the development costs are going to be spread out throughout those 20 years. Because the offshore wind projects will likely last longer than 20 years, we might be able to enter an even cheaper contract with that same offshore wind project after the 20 years, and that'll keep costs down even lower in the future. We have a question around meeting with conservationists around wind energy, as well as coordinating with commercial fishermen. This is a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. You're absolutely right that commercial fishermen often feel left out of the process. We have done some outreach and coordination, brainstorming ways to work together. One way that we have worked together is by agreeing that we want to see a public process around designing requests for proposals for offshore wind development. So the process of offshore wind development starts with the state or the utility company releasing a request for proposals that outlines all of the things that developers have to do to submit a bid for a contract. We believe that the public should have the opportunity to weigh in on that request for proposal, make suggestions. For example, commercial fishermen should be able to review that request for proposal and make suggestions upon what they want to see required from the developers related to mitigating impacts on commercial fishing. Similarly, we think that environmentalists, members of the public, anyone should have a chance to weigh in on what goes into the offshore wind development proposals. That said, I don't think we're doing enough. I think the offshore wind advocates and commercial fishermen have had a contentious relationship in the past, and with a lot of misunderstanding, and I would really like to see more collaboration in the future. All right, that was the end of the questions that I'm seeing here, but I'll stay on for a couple more minutes in case there's any more questions. Again, please feel free to jump in, and if not, just a reminder that you should check out our website for this event on Wednesday. I would love to see as many of you there as possible. You can also donate to our advocacy programs on our website and read all of those good climate policy updates. And I am going to just leave this slide about where you can find your senator and representatives information so that you can go right now before we're going to end this webinar a little bit early. So before you log off of your computer for lunch to go outside and enjoy the nice weather, make sure you call your legislators in support of 100% renewable by 2030. And have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining.